The day my life unraveled, the mail came with a weight I could almost hear before I saw the envelope. My name stamped in big, harsh letters, demanding money I didn't borrow, and responsibility I never agreed to. In that moment, standing in the narrow entryway of my modest apartment, every small certainty I'd built for decades seemed to flicker, because my own name, the one I thought belonged to me alone, had become a leash, dragging me into someone else's disaster. I am 54, just 6 winters away from my 60th birthday, and up until that morning, I thought the arc of my days was finally gentle. With a tiny alteration shop in the corner of the market, I spent my hours coaxing torn seams and worn-out hems back to life. My husband, Sang-ho, retired from the factory long ago and now spends his afternoons at the senior center. Our 2 children have their own busy lives. Sometimes photos of our grandchildren would appear on my phone, and I'd set out a plate of apple slices and quietly believe the world still had something sweet left for me. At least I believed that, until the day a creditor's letter, addressed to me as a guarantor, landed in my mailbox and shattered whatever peace I had. I remember sitting on the plastic stool outside my shop, the wind cold against my face, unable to process how my name became entangled with debts from a cafe I'd never set foot in. My husband's younger sister, Mi-jung, had started that business, and months earlier, I'd half listened as she spoke quickly about needing a few documents for her loan. I didn't recall hearing words like guarantor or truly understanding what I'd signed. Family is family, I thought. In-laws spent years bragging about my spotless credit, and I, wanting to keep the harmony, stamped my seal where they asked, believing it was just a harmless favor. I was so naive. The truth is, what family asks weighs heavier than any notarized seal, and what creditors write is sharper than it first appears. I told myself mainly I was helping, preserving my husband's fragile dignity, avoiding drama. I even congratulated myself for being so mature about it. That was the story I told myself. But it fell apart when the mail came. I hid the letter in the deepest corner of my bag, pretending nothing had changed. I still had my secret nest egg after all, a small savings account I'd quietly built by tucking away small earnings, just in case. It wasn't much, but it was mine alone, the only patch of ground I could claim in this unpredictable world. I refused to accept that someone else's mistakes could force me to give up the one security I'd created for myself. That quiet pride was the only thing I felt truly belonged to me. But reality was relentless. Every month, another grey envelope would materialize, the language growing more severe, each one a little heavier than the last. In desperation, I called the finance company. The worker on the other end listed off the late payments, the ballooning interest, everything I owed simply because I had once trusted blood over paperwork. My hands trembled, but I recorded the call, clinging to some hope that proof might help if things turned uglier. It was all I had, the careful collection of records, each one a pebble in my pocket to keep me steady in the long, dark walk ahead. That night, anxiety ate at me. Should I tell my husband or keep this burden to myself? I couldn't even decide if his pride and my own were growing on the same tree, or if they'd slowly forked into separate branches over the years. At dawn, I resolved to start with Mi-jung. I called and asked to meet in person. The next afternoon, I sat in a nearly empty cafe, my heart pounding as silence pressed against us. When she brought out the paperwork, I saw my own seal on the bright, official documents from a bank I didn't know. Across the pages were scatterings of notes and hurried signatures, physical proof that I'd been part of something I had barely grasped. Her excuses spilled out. Business was slow, rent was rising, costs were out of control. I nodded, still tracing the edges of the papers with my thumb. But my mind was stuck on one fact. Why had my name ended up on all of this? I pressed for details, wanting to know who submitted my certificate, who managed the paperwork. She was vague, saying things moved too quickly, circumstances were urgent. I could see her troubles. But I kept thinking back to my mother's old ledgers, how debts never disappeared and guilt always returned, each time worse than before. Soon, official-looking letters showed up with legal threats. Frightened, I went to the local office for advice. The civil servant's tone was so neutral, it made me feel even smaller. At home, I'd run numbers over and over. The amount needed just to keep the collectors at bay surpassed what I could touch without raiding my secret savings. One late night, I unfolded the old envelopes holding my emergency funds, feeling the paper's familiar texture. I paid some of what I owed, enough to buy time, and tucked the rest away, like a bandage pressed over a wound that wouldn't heal. I met with the finance officer, presented my plan, begged for leniency, clinging to any sliver of hope. I always recorded these conversations. Documents, not promises, felt trustworthy. If I'd learned anything, it was that numbers may hurt, but they don't betray. Debt, however, does not tire. I started getting calls from unknown numbers. Even the local police checked in, sending chills of embarrassment and panic through my chest. At night, I watched my husband's sleeping silhouette, dreading the moment I might have to confess. I'd known Sang-ho for decades. His sense of honor could be a trap, stubbornly refusing to show weakness. And I was more afraid of his shame than of any creditor's threat. Sometimes, the first cracks in a home appear so quietly. Just a word, a secret, the tiniest misjudgment buried for months, until one day it splits open the wall. Debt had begun to creep along the edges of my family. Face, that slippery thing our whole family cherished, now felt as thin as tissue, threatening to rip with every passing day. But if it would tear, I was determined to find out who, really, was pulling at the seams. I arranged to see Mi-jung again, this time in a plain noodle shop at the center of the crowded market. My approach was different. I told myself I would not look away or be silenced by politeness. With my phone quietly recording in my bag, I pressed her harder, trying to understand where responsibility really lay. The conversation twisted and tangled. But then, in the middle, her phone rang. She moved aside to answer, and I caught only fragments of her voice. When she returned, her expression had changed. A kind of hesitation, sadness, and relief all at once. Suddenly, I sensed something deeper at play. Something she was too tired to hide any longer. The real truth fell into my lap that night as I closed the refrigerator door and spotted a folder left on the table. Inside was a stack of documents, copies of the original loan agreement, bank paperwork, and a business card from the broker who'd handled the guarantee. Tucked in was a note, written in a script I knew by heart and marked with my husband's signature arrows, the exact kind he's doodled for decades, underlining thoughts for only me to see. My hands went numb. The truth was undeniable. This had never really been about Mi-jung's cafe. the one who asked for my name, the one who orchestrated the whole arrangement without ever truly telling me, was my own husband. In his bid to maintain his dignity, to cover his own missteps with his retirement money, he had built a story that made me an unwitting accomplice, using his family ties to cushion the blow, and trusted that I would say yes if I thought I was helping his sister instead of him. It all fell into place now, the quiet nods at family dinners, the way the paperwork had moved through his hands before ending up at mine, the careful erasing of his own role from the entire process. Even now, remembering that moment, I can barely recall how I managed to sit and breathe. But as he came home that night, I told him what I had found. Calmly, methodically, I explained what I'd figured out, who had moved which documents, who had benefited, and when. I told him I had evidence, recordings, and documents, and I would not let my name be used as a mask ever again. Maybe he denied it at first, as pride so often does, but in the end, my certainty, my records, and my resolve left him with no more places to hide. I realized then that everything I thought I was hiding, my savings, my pride, my responsibility, were all just different faces of the same story. In the days that followed, I moved swiftly. I contacted the bank, put down a large payment to pause legal action, and submitted every document myself. My secret savings became the umbrella I hoped I'd never have to open. Instead, I had to shred it for a raincoat, using every scrap to shield our family from the worst of the fallout. Time was my only prize. With it, Sango and I mapped out a new plan. He, Mijong, and I would share the repayments, but every step would now be double-checked by me. Word spread through the market. As it always does, someone had lost a house to a botched guarantee. Someone's son-in-law had gone bust on a bad investment. I said nothing, just turned each hem, stitched each sleeve with deliberate care. My vows grew sharper. I would never again let my name be borrowed lightly. Never again let a sense of family or pride cloud my judgment, and never again let money determine whose mistakes I was willing to shoulder. Sango found his own way to reckon with what happened. He went to the pastor and then quietly told our children, explaining the mess and the hard lesson we'd both learned. Secrets rot, especially within families, and once they do, their stench cannot be hidden. We talk to our children about lines that must never be crossed, about the responsibilities that come with giving or taking a name for someone else's debt. They were stunned, but also relieved. Our mess could have been far larger. We contained it. Barely. I won't pretend all was forgiven. My husband's relationship with his sister will bear scars, and I spent several nights organizing files and records in case we needed them again. But I am grateful I did not let my anger destroy what little love remained. People make foolish choices. Sometimes those mistakes shake the law. Sometimes they shake the heart. I can only hope that this time the heart survived with less damage. Life, after a storm, returns to its quiet rhythm. I went back to work with my needles and thread, closing up hems and patching holes for familiar customers. The secret savings book is no longer quite so secret. Sang-ho wrote a promise in his own hand never to touch those funds again without my consent. I tucked it deep in the drawer like an old photograph. Paper remembers longer than people do, and memory, in the end, keeps us honest. Looking back, I finally feel a sense of lightness on my shoulders. I still hesitate when I hear the word face or pride. But one thing is clear now. Dignity is not a gift for others, but a duty to myself, a guardrail, so I don't lose who I am in the name of someone else's comfort. Lending your name may look like kindness, but inside that package is a hard box labeled responsibility. Debt breaks relationships, not just balances, and a secret account can be protection for the soul, not just the wallet. And in the end, records and evidence are not weapons for revenge, but ropes to hold on to truth as life tries to sweep you away. So tell me, if you were in my position, where would you draw the line between your dignity, your family's pride, and your own good name?